Warning, spoilers ahead. Marvel's Black Panther is smashing both expectations and box office records left and right. And even though it's early days, it's pretty obvious by now that Marvel has done something more than make a box office hit. They've made this comic book movie whose significance goes way past the bounds of the genre by showing these representations of Africans and African Americans that are very different from the usual images of poverty, slavery, and oppression. And now instead, it replaces them with images of self-determined, empowered, enlightened, and even regal characters. It's pretty evident from audience response that there has been a real hunger for a movie just like this one. And it isn't because this is the first time we've seen a black superhero on the big screen. In the MCU alone, we have Falcon and War Machine who are with the Avengers, and Black Panther himself debuted in Captain America Civil War. On the Marvel side, not in the MCU, we also have Halle Berry playing Storm in the X-Men movies. Over on the other side of the divide, there's Cyborg in the Justice League. But even way before all of this, Wesley Snipes already did those 3 movies as the Vampire Blade, also a Marvel superhero, even though at the time there was no MCU, seeing as the first Blade film came out in 1998 and the last one did in 2004. So the Blade trilogy can claim the distinction of being the first to have a black superhero protagonist, but the response to those films are really nowhere near this overwhelming outpouring of accolades and support that the Black Panther is receiving. So, what's the difference? Well, to be perfectly frank, the Blade films really weren't all that great. They were fun, they were good for whiling away a couple of hours, but they didn't really have anything to say. Black Panther, on the other hand, does have something to say. In fact, it has a lot to say. And one of the most powerful messages of this movie is embodied not in its characters, but in its setting. I am, of course, talking about Wakanda. It's easy to dismiss Wakanda as just this utopian fantasy, because to be perfectly honest, that's what it is. But if we dissect what utopias are and how Wakanda changes that formula, we begin to see that there's a real power to it. This is the kind of fantasy that shapes the way that we live out our reality. But first, let's take a look at what utopia actually is. Now, utopia is usually understood to be a perfect society that is achieved through reason and technology, so it's supposed to be this perfect place. But the word utopia itself, literally translated from Greek, means no place.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Nowhere.
We must be over the rainbow.
Utopia was the title of this political satire written by Sir Thomas More, who was the Lord High Chancellor of England for Henry VIII. Well, he was Lord High Chancellor, at least until Henry wanted to dump his wife of 20 years for this younger woman, and Sir Thomas refused to give his support. Henry's response to that was to have his head cut off. So yeah, England wasn't what Sir Thomas had in mind when he wrote about a perfect place. Instead, he set his ideal society on this faraway, imaginary island, and he used this model of perfection as a way of criticizing his own government. Sir Thomas never intended to imply that it was possible for utopia to actually exist. That's why he called it no place. But it was during this particular time in Europe that all these nations were sending fleets into Asia and Africa for trade and exploration, sure, but their main purpose was to build and expand their empires. The world hadn't been completely mapped out, and the collective European imagination was really on fire, thinking that out there, maybe there was this unexplored, undiscovered paradise. And there's actually a direct reference to this in the movie Black Panther. Remember Claw talking about the search for El Dorado in the interrogation room? Well, yeah, that was basically what he was talking about. But historically, of course, we know what happened. The map of our world became more and more filled out, and the whole concept of El Dorado and utopia became less and less believable, fading more and more into obscurity. In the 1800s, however, with the whole Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, the Western world underwent a lot of radical changes. and there was something else that set the collective consciousness on fire. But this time, it was this firm, unshakable faith in science and the progress it would bring. Utopia was relevant again, but this time, people weren't expecting to find it. They were instead expecting to build it. Or, to be more accurate, they were expecting that advances in science and technology made utopia this whole, bright, inevitable future. Just to show how powerful this idea was, in the United States, Edward Bellamy wrote about the perfection he was sure the world would have achieved by the year 2000, and so many people believed in it, they got together and formed Bellamite nationalist clubs, who were dedicated to hastening the advent of this future. Not bad for a piece of utopian fantasy, if you ask me. Of course, this whole idea of utopia rested on the concept that science and technology were inherently good, that all progress was inherently good. However, time, World War I and World War II, and then the atom bomb, effectively disillusioned everybody of that notion. So again, that particular concept of utopia lost its power because it also became impossible to believe in. Now we come to this movie, Black Panther. That is the most amazing thing about what the cast and crew have achieved in Black Panther by bringing Wakanda to life. This is a very different utopia, and not just because it's set in Africa and it's populated by Africans. For one thing, it's obviously not in some way off distant future. Wakanda is in the here and now, and that changes things. In fact, it's always supposed to have been here. It has just been hidden. But it's not like the myth of El Dorado. In fact, it's nothing like El Dorado. El Dorado, even though it's an imaginary place, it's an imaginary place without a history, and it doesn't have a people with a will of their own. It was conceived of in terms of riches and prosperity, just waiting passively for intrepid adventurers to find it. Nobody dreamed up an El Dorado with defenses or an army, much less this kick-ass all-female one like the Dora Milaje. So, El Dorado doesn't have a story of how it started, how it grew to become rich and prosperous. Wakanda, on the other hand, has a history, it has a myth, and its peace was hard-won. It was fought over and negotiated between tribes until the Black Panther came out on top. Its prosperity is the result not just of the advantage of sitting on this huge mountain of vibranium, but because there were generations of Wakandans using that resource to help their nation. And although one of Wakanda's defining characteristics is its advanced technology, there are these vast differences from the Western 19th century idea of science-driven utopia. For one thing, even if we just look at it, we can see that Wakanda is this green utopia. Half skyscrapers, half rainforest. Their warriors ride war rhinos instead of tanks. There are huge tracts of land that are completely untouched. Even inside the city itself, we can see that the roads aren't even paved. This is a society that lives with nature and doesn't just try to control and subdue it, which is one of the things science was expected to do in 1800s Europe and America. Other big differences? Western utopia was focused on being very forward-looking, and it was based on rationality, social organization, and control. There wasn't much room for spirituality, what would be considered irrational and superstitious, and progress was expected to do away with any quote-unquote primitive customs or impulses in society. In other words, the heart-shaped herb, the ritual combat for the right to rule, the praise to the ancestors, the king being buried and meeting with the spirits of his fathers, none of that would have any place in a Western utopia. But all of that not just has this place in Wakanda, but make Wakanda the country it is. Those things are at the very heart of the nation, not science and not technology. It's a society that looks both forward and back. In fact, it can be accused to be looking more backward in terms of preserving its customs and centuries-long policy of isolationism. But coming to grips with all that is one of the major conflicts of Black Panther, and I think it's resolved well, on more than one level. T'Challa is able to fulfill not just his responsibility to Wakanda, but Wakanda's responsibility to the world. Killmonger's rage and pain find this measure of vindication in his cousin's decision. And last but not least, the rest of the world will have access to vibranium just in time for Infinity War, so they won't be caught with their pants down when Thanos comes knocking. Or at least not completely. I could go on and on about what Wakanda gets right, gender equality being another major plus for it. But what really sets Wakanda apart is that what makes it utopia isn't its prosperity or technology. Neither of those things are its defining characteristics. It's a utopia built from two things: its memory and its people. And that's why it's a pretty special place. It doesn't matter that it's not real. What matters is that it's possible to believe that it could be. If you like our video, give us a thumbs up. If there's any topic you'd like us to cover, leave your comment below.
And don't forget to subscribe if you'd like to see more content from us.